Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's eLearning Career Chat, where we chat with different people in the industry about how they got into eLearning and instructional design and a bunch of other cool things. If you're just joining us for the first time, welcome. I see many of you are typing into chat, introducing yourself, which is fantastic. Um, as Nyla and I are talking back and forth about all sorts of different things, you'll notice up in the tab next to the chat panel, there's a questions pod, which people have already started putting in questions, but you can put in your questions for Nyla or myself and upvote on others while you're there as well. So make sure to check that out. Hi, Nyla. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. I am
Good.
Hello from the Netherlands, everybody. So I think it's lunch or maybe a little earlier for some of you, and it's the end of my day here. So
Oh, I'm jealous that your Wednesday's over because mine is literally just
just
beginning. So
beginning. Yeah.
yeah. Well, thank you so much for doing this. Uh, I know we've been following each other online. We've had a chance to talk a little bit in the past, and I think where most people know you from is leading Design by Humanity, and then you also have your really fantastic podcast. I'm new here, which is fantastic. But can you tell everybody, for those who don't know you, a little bit more about yourself and what you do for a living? And while you're at it, if you want to explain while you're in the Netherlands as well, by all means, feel free to.
Sure. Yes, I'm Nyla Spooner, and I am a learning experience designer. And how did I get here? Well, I started out. Um, I went into a program because I thought I wanted to do organizational development. And it was that time after college, in between, it was my midlife, what is it called?
I call it a career identity crisis.
It
Uh,
was that, a career
yeah.
identity crisis. I was like between 25 and 27. I didn't know
Yep.
what I wanted to do. And I actually went into a program in my undergrad, a communication program. And so I thought I wanted to do PR. And then I was like, that's not my life's calling.
Yeah.
And I ended up working, for those of you from Texas, I worked at HEB grocery store for 5 years. And I have to say that that really helped me kind of narrow down the fact that I wanted to do something with people, which surprised me as an introvert. But I enjoyed working with people and talent management. I worked in the office at HEB and hired people and thought I wanted to go that route. So I found a program at U of H and thought I was going to do like organization development or people or talent management or something like that. But then I ended up in an instructional design class, and it was the hardest class I've ever taken. I had never been challenged at that to think critically in that way. I had an excellent professor, Professor Waite from University of Houston. And I just really fell in love with the challenge of instructional design. And I really liked e-learning design as well, because I love making little cute PowerPoints and everything. So it combined all of these things that I like, and I just dove into it. So from there, I struggled a little bit after I got out of the program to find a job. But my professional network helped me find a job in oil and gas. And that's where I really cut my teeth in instructional design. And then I realized I was doing kind of like a hybrid of things in my role.
Yep.
And I didn't have the language for it or the vocabulary. And I was like, it's instructional design, but it's something else. I was exploring like user experience and looking into user interface design. So that's when I discovered learning experience design. And we'll talk about that more later.
Sure.
But currently, I am a learning designer at IKEA Systems. So that means, if you don't know, IKEA is a franchisor, and I work for the franchisor. And I create learning experiences for the franchisees. And right now I'm working on a project for the entire company. So that's how I ended up in the Netherlands. It has been quite a journey. And sometimes it is very uncomfortable, but I know that I'm in a season of growth in my career, and I think that's exciting. So that is the fast version of me and what I
Yeah.
do. I'm also co-founder of Design by Humanity. We're a design collective where we help Black, Indigenous people of color work in kind of like a corporate simulator for learning design. And I also have a podcast where I just try to share all of the things I wish I knew about the career of learning design, instructional design with people. So
I love
that's
that.
me. Yeah. And I saw someone, yes, was having a quarter life crisis.
A
Thank you.
quarter. Oh, I like that. I haven't heard that one before.
Yeah.
Yeah, a quarter life crisis is totally like when you were describing that, I went through that for sure
Yep.
at that age. So if you were to go back in time and tell yourself that you'd be living in the Netherlands and and there would be a global pandemic, like what would you have thought?
I probably would have been like, that sounds crazy and about right. I don't think I would be surprised because I'm random. I'm random like that.
Yeah,
But I never like had a passion to come to the Netherlands.
sure.
But I did know I wanted to experience life and outside of just my little bubble.
Okay.
And I was curious how people did that. And I thought like I would have to have a job already and then they transferred me somewhere.
Yeah.
But I'm a big advocate of LinkedIn
Yeah.
and a big advocate of like being strategic about how you promote what you can do. It's a new world out there and a lot of people have trouble navigating it. Unfortunately, visibility does equal, I don't want to say that it equals validity, but
No.
you do really, I use some of my PR background
Yeah.
to help me on LinkedIn.
Oh, sure.
And that definitely helped. Just talking openly about my journey and what I do and things I come across and sharing them with my social networks helped me get noticed, I think, by a larger group than if I just stayed in my own little bubble. So that's how I ended up in the Netherlands. And it's crazy, but I'm here.
Yeah, I mean, I love that you say when you said, "Well, that's random," and that's something I would do. I heard something very different. So you said earlier about how you're in this season of growth, right? You did
Mhm.
something like really big that you use the word random. Like I look at that and I go, "Oh, Nyla's really brave." Like Nyla's brave in the sense that she's willing to push herself willingly outside her comfort zone. And you describe that in your story about, thinking you had this career path and then you stumble across things and you kind of stumbled into something you would never have expected for yourself, right? And I think that's a lot of times, at least in my experience, when you choose to embrace that stumbling outside of the lines that you thought were drawn for you, you're really pushing yourself outside your comfort zone.
Yeah.
And the growth that comes out of that and the willingness to kind of embrace making that leap, it usually results in really great things.
Yeah. And I think that's why I've been willing to be more uncomfortable. I wasn't always like this.
No, yeah.
But I see what comes out of that discomfort. And there's a difference between the discomfort that will lead to growth and then the discomfort that's telling you to get out of a situation. So it takes a lot of discernment to figure out the difference there.
Yeah.
But so yeah, I'm like constantly in a state of like, for instance, this week I had to demo something that I'm working on that is very raw and
Okay.
so it's like when you're in art school and you've got to do your critique and everyone looks at it and they give you their very honest feedback.
Yeah.
And everyone was like, oh, you're so, you handle that so well. And I'm like, yeah, but I just want to be clear that I was still very uneasy about it and uncomfortable. Like it's, it's definitely a bruise to the ego,
Yeah.
but you really have to get in a place where your ego isn't in charge. So trying to
Yeah,
be
I mean,
there.
so how do you discern? I love that distinction. I haven't thought of that before about the discomfort. That's the good discomfort versus the
Mhm.
discomfort of it's a sign that you need to get the heck out of what you're doing. How have you learned to discern the difference between those?
I think being like, well, sometimes I do need to bounce situations off like a good friend or colleague,
Mm-hmm.
sponsor, coach, whoever you can have professionally who can say, hey, this is a situation I'm in. I just want to talk to you about it. I
Yeah.
feel discomfort and I don't know which way. But if you don't, not everybody has that, and that takes a lot of trust. So I guess for me, it's just about figuring out, am I uncomfortable because of my own beliefs or someone else making me uncomfortable? So
Mm-hmm.
like, is the discomfort coming from me and like my own insecurities,
Yep.
or has somebody created an unsafe environment for me?
Yeah.
And yeah,
I get
that's
that.
what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
That totally makes sense. I think for me, one of the things I've learned, I totally agree with you. Like for me, I've had to learn, and it's not some, I agree with you. Like I wasn't this way for a long part of my career, but learning to kind of step outside of yourself and evaluate whether or not that experience, that job, that thing you're doing, is it serving the long-term version you have for yourself and your career? And
Right.
I think the big part, first off, in order to answer that question, is you have to have a long-term vision and purpose for yourself and your career to
Mm-hmm.
be able to identify that. And if it is, then good. That might be a good discomfort. And if it's not, it's
Mm-hmm.
probably a sign that you're moving in the wrong direction, I
Yeah.
suppose. Yeah,
Yeah.
good. I love that.
Yeah.
So, okay, so let's pivot into talking about learning experience design. So, you define yourself as a learning experience designer. I love how you said that you didn't have the words to describe what it is that you were doing in the field of learning. It was something greater and slightly different than instructional design, and then introduced this term learning experience design. And so, uh, I have opinions about learning experience design versus instructional design, but I'm curious to know how you define the difference. Like, is there a difference between instructional design and learning experience design fundamentally, or is it an issue of confusion how employers label the positions? Like, in your opinion, how would you define the difference, and what's the cause of all the confusion between the two?
Okay, so I'll start with, I definitely think a lot of the confusion comes from employers hearing the
Yeah,
term and thinking that's what they need, and
yeah,
then hiring for something that doesn't maybe need that special title.
yeah,
So there is a formal definition of LXD from a couple of places. So
yeah.
Niels Floor has become the LXD person. I personally think that there were some other people using the term before him, but
Sure.
he really like built a brand around what
It
a learning experience
formalized
does.
it.
Right. He formalized the definition of it, has a framework for how to work within it and everything. So a lot of people defer to Niels and what LXD is. So he has a website called lxd.org where he's got resources and explanations and everything. Um, I had this discussion with that professor I mentioned before.
Mm-hmm.
She taught me instructional design, but she taught very human-centered instructional design. So when she saw I was using learning experience designer, she asked me why, what is the difference? Fundamentally for me, I really didn't do, when I was learning ID in that program, I really wasn't learning about, I guess, I didn't learn design thinking or human-centered design. We didn't
Sure.
really go too deep into UX, user experience. Um, and then I was spending a lot of time developing e-learning courses, digital products for learning, but I had
Mm-hmm.
to do like additional research into how to design for digital on
Yeah.
top of how to create, how to do the science of adult learning. So for me, I think the very minimal difference is that ID is like a very systematic approach, scientific approach to adult learning with art mixed into it,
Okay.
because I once mentioned that ID should be considered a STEM career, and
Interesting.
that started a very big discussion on LinkedIn one day where nobody agreed with me. So
Of
I'd like
course
to
not.
revisit that. Um, but so that's why I started using Learning Experience Designer, because I was just I was applying some of the framework of instructional design,
Yeah.
but also really prototyping, doing iterations, going back and trying again, putting out something early, testing early, getting feedback from learners, and going back again. So I understand that the term doesn't have that big of a difference. And if you talk to Niels, to him, it is, because he doesn't
Yeah.
have an instructional design background. He came from UX
Oh, I
and
didn't
was
know that.
designing.
Okay.
He said, I was already designing learning experiences without ever having done instructional design. So I understand why it's a difference for him.
Yeah.
It's like where the origins come from.
Right.
So that's why there are all of these overlapping disciplines of UX. UX has very similar processes from what we do.
Yeah.
And then learning experience design, instructional design, but then like little outliers of things that separate them just a bit, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. The thing that I often wonder, I did a video about a month or two ago about breaking down the different titles used in our industry: instructional designer, learning program manager, e-learning designer, and learning experience designer.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And Neil, he commented, he disagreed with me, and that's totally fine. And I didn't know he didn't have an instructional design background, which is fascinating. And I think the thing that I continually debate in my mind, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, Nyla, is learning experience design truly something that's a different job, that should be a different job or role than an e-learning designer or instructional designer? Or is that just really what the practice of learning experience design, is that just what instructional designers, e-learning designers, or whatever else you call yourself, if you're creating learning content, isn't that what we should be doing as e-learning designers, instructional designers, or whatever you call yourself? Because I think, like, as I look at the practices of learning experience design, that human-centered approach, thinking about the total experience before and during and after the actual training event, looking at the user interface or the user experience, I mean, all of those things, I feel like those are things that we should be doing as instructional designers or e-learning developers. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that there are, depending on like where you get your education on instructional design, I think some people probably missed out on some of the more design, like visual design focused things.
Sure.
And maybe that's where that gap is coming from. I really do think the problem is there's what you do, and then there's your job title. Like my job title isn't learning experience designer, it's learning designer. My job title might be senior instructional designer, but I could still be a learning experience designer. So whatever your discipline is, whatever you want to become an expert in, okay, that doesn't necessarily have to be your job title. So I kind of wish that these companies would just title, like, what do you need this person to do, whatever that title is, and make it clear so that we can understand, okay, you're looking for someone who can design face-to-face workshops and do e-learning, or you're looking for someone to create blended, whatever that title is. But did I make my point?
No, that totally makes sense. I totally agree with you. I think so much of the confusion, we started this conversation about that, and I think that it's important to circle back to it, is that so much of the confusion, I think, is hiring managers or talent acquisition departments. They cling on to these buzzwords like
Mhm.
learning experience designer, and
Mhm.
when really they're hiring an e-learning developer or a
Right.
multimedia person, or maybe it's a an instructor-led training content developer, or a blended learning training
Yeah.
developer, whatever the case might be. And so I think the point to be made there for anyone watching who's looking to get into our industry, who's not familiar with it, you know, some positions say instructional designer, and you might be doing e-learning design all day long, or
Yes.
you're an e-learning developer, but you're spending 50% of your time developing stuff for the classroom, or
Yeah.
right. I mean, and so it's less about the title, it's more about what is, and I think it's important that applicants really ask those questions, like what is it that you're going to be doing day to day, regardless of what they title that position, or even regardless of what they put in the job description. A lot of job descriptions are just copied and pasted templates that they've used over and over and over again, when really what they need is something different and specific.
Right. And I've definitely fallen into the trap of just looking at a title and not
Mm-hmm.
fully understanding what I would be doing before I got into the position. So even through interviews, I sit there and I'm like, oh, I'm just a content developer. I'm not
Right.
doing any kind of, someone else is doing the strategy or the front end analysis, and I'm just getting that. And that was fine. I just was at a different place in my career. So I've
Yep.
already done the e-learning development. I wanted to get a little better at front end analysis. So then I'm going to look for a position that focuses on that. And I just think these are things that you will pick up on as you get a little more seasoned in your career.
Mm-hmm.
So if you do end up in a position where you're like, I don't know where this is going right now,
Yeah.
there can always be opportunities for you to maybe brush up on a skill in that time and then find out where you need to go. I just personally, the titles mean a little, but like what you can actually do and produce means more. So
Yeah. Oh, I totally agree with you on that. I think it's also important to remember that there, despite what people might say online or whatever content's out there, there's no single way that a learning or instructional design team is structured and operates with an organization. It is every company I've ever worked at, it's been slightly different.
yeah,
Sometimes instructional designers, their title, that's what they do, but they're doing everything A to Z, from the needs analysis, stakeholder management, project management, to design, development, whatever that might be. They might even do facilitation or
yeah,
implementation or evaluation. And other teams, the term instructional designer, you're just purely focused on creating the content. They might be a learning program manager doing the strategy, or and then an LMS admin doing the implementation, or even you might have a separate graphic designer helping develop your graphics, right?
yep.
And so there's no one way that teams are structured within organizations. The challenge is discerning, when they say instructional designer, what does that mean to that organization, and do your
Hmm.
skills fit into that box, right?
Right, right, right.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you're interested, and I know a lot of people that have moved from, maybe they were IDs and then they were like, okay, now I'm an LXD, and then
Mm-hmm.
they just moved fully into UX. And then UX itself has all these different branches. Like you could just do user experience research where you're just
Yep.
helping organizations find out more about their users.
Yep.
So, I mean, I think LXD gives me the it helps me. I use the title because it helps me keep track of what I want to do and what I want my jobs to include.
Yep.
But in my podcast, I use the term instructional designer. Um, I think that people have a better understanding fully of what that is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I use them interchangeably, but I know that there are subtle differences. It just depends, like, who am I talking to and what's the full understanding of what it is. And
Yeah.
yeah.
You make a great point about making that transition from LXD to UX. I mean, I think of when you said that, I was thinking of, I don't know if you know Roberta Dombrowski.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I did one of these sessions with her a couple weeks ago, and she was somebody who was a learning experience designer, and now she's I think the VP of UX or user research
Oh,
for
nice.
a learning company. I can't remember which learning company it is off the
Yeah.
top of my head, but you know, and it kind of goes back to what you said at the beginning of when you had your quarter life crisis, is a lot of times our careers evolve in ways that we would never expect as you get exposed to jobs and responsibilities that, might have never occurred to you otherwise. Right.
Right. And then that's really how I ended up here. Like if I hadn't have gotten that job at HEB and ended up at the admin in the store and then looked up this program at U of H, I don't know. I never would have found out what instructional design is at all. So
yeah, totally. Okay, cool. Well, we have like 20 questions in the questions pod. So we'll try to get through them all. I doubt we will. So we'll do our best. So thank you for everyone who's been putting in questions. I love it. Okay, so let me, our first question comes from Marina Kamensky. I apologize if I got your name wrong, Marina. She has 48 votes on this question, so that's fantastic. Marina wants to know difference between job roles, instructional designers versus learning experience designers. I mean, I think we kind of tackled that a little bit. I don't know. Do you have anything else to add to that one, Nyla?
I mean, I think if other LXD people wrote the job description, it's one thing. If it's a company that doesn't have other learning designers and they're like, I think we need a learning experience designer, then I would say the only thing you can do is really analyze the job description and then use your interview to ask as many questions as possible.
Yeah.
Because I don't know how else you can know. And I've looked at I did a podcast episode about this for my Patreon members, like analyzing a job descriptions. And then like Kara North just released that paper about analyzing the skills needed to be an instructional designer. So there's some more research going into it, but at this point, I think we just really have to sit with the hiring manager and ask them, what are you looking for? But I totally 100% agree. It's less about, like, Nyla, you and I could give our definition about the difference between the two, and I think we've talked a little bit about that, but it's more important that you understand how the person who's interviewing you defines the difference between the two. And the likelihood is if we went out on LinkedIn today and asked everybody to define learning experience design and got 10 answers, they would all be different. So, and I think about that when I read posts and then Neil's floors in the comments.
Yeah.
Be like, I have a website where I wrote all this out. We're all just like, no, we have our own definition.
Well, that's, but then that is, I've been in this industry over 10 years and I feel like one of the things that I enjoy about our industry, it's kind of a double-edged sword, is we love buzzwords and we love to sit there and like beat it up and tear it apart and overanalyze it to figure out what it means. Think about like gamification or learning or mobile learning. I mean, accessibility. I mean, the world of accessibility and what it means for our industry has become so much more nuanced and defined than it even was 5 years ago. Accessibility just meant closed captioning and, tab order. And now it's so much more than just that, right? And I think the same will be true for learning experience design.
Yeah, and I think really people are trying to put words to the evolution of things. We do that with everything. Like this thing has evolved. Maybe it needs a new name now. And I think that's just where it was going. So
sure.
Maybe it's not that it's different, maybe that it's evolving. So yeah,
totally. Okay. Rebecca wants to know examples of Mustknow tools, technology for learning experience designers versus instructional designers. What are some of the Mustknow tools, technology, in your opinion, Nyla?
So I was thinking about this, and then tools are tools, and we may call it one thing, and then a teacher's like, oh, I have something like that, I call it this.
Right.
But one thing I didn't do before I started really looking into LXD was like wireframing as a tool, but that's like similar to storyboarding, but still a little different. And then like paper prototyping, that kind of thing. So those are all, I guess, mixture of tools and skills.
And practices.
Right. For how to kick off a project when you're ready to start um, developing like the visual style or the
Yeah.
of it. Other tools, if you're really trying to analyze your audience or your potential learners. So like in the program I was in, we used, you do a learner analysis or you do a task analysis. And it was very much like I wrote a whole paper and answered questions. It was 40 pages of analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And then for learning experience design, there's a user persona map or
Yep.
an experience map. So it's not 40 pages of analysis, but it's, you're still filling out very detailed things about what your user might like and what situation they may find themselves and what barriers to access they may have. And so they're similar, but one is maybe a little bit more, I don't know. They're both analytical, but
Yeah.
you see my point there.
Yeah. I mean, I think all of that comes down to, and I know these aren't explicit like tools. I mean, the tools that we use every day, whether it's Storyline or PowerPoint or Captivate or Camtasia, I mean, those are just a means to an end to create an experience, right? And those will constantly evolve and change, and there'll be new tools. But talking about like the processes or practices of learning experience design, it really just comes down to and we talk about human-centered design or learner-centered design. It's about empathy. And it's about knowing, like, this is the way I've tried to describe it to folks is, when you think about an e-learning course or you're an instructional designer, you think about the course, like this confined thing that you create in Storyline and you put it in the LMS. And learning experience design is looking at things before and after that course and during the course. Like what happens that leads that learner to realizing that they struggle with something, or maybe they don't realize it. And then how do they get to the resources that help them? And then once they get those resources, how does that get used afterwards? It's like this total experience. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it just encompasses more than just the individual learning object that you've created. I don't know.
And a lot of, or I don't want to say a lot, but there's some folks who say, in instructional design, the needs of the organization are the ultimate needs. And there's some with that point of view. And I don't necessarily disagree with that. If you're in a corporate space and you're trying to meet some KPIs, you need to show like what's the return on investment for having this learning department, then you really do want to be clear about what your organizational goals are, even above your user and learner.
Yeah.
But if, on the other hand, if you're creating something that is user focused and ultimately should still benefit the organization anyway. So I guess there are arguments for both.
I agree. I totally agree. I often say, I can't remember which presentation or where I've said this. I know I've said it somewhere. Like our job as learning professionals is balancing the wants of the organization, meeting KPIs, meeting numbers, selling more things, being more efficient, and the needs of the learner. And sometimes those things don't line up perfectly. Sometimes one gets more priority over the other. Yeah. I don't know if that makes any sense.
I think it makes sense. It makes sense. I think what's most important is that no matter whether you're practicing instructional design or learning experience design, you're either an internal and an external consultant. You are the learning expert. So when you get in there, you have to figure out how what they need you to do and what you need from them, whether or not it's LXD or ID or whatever. But I did want to mention, somebody said something that caught my eye. PJ Chung said, my doctorate is in adult learning, and I feel that employers are wanting less expertise in adult learning theories, but more expertise in UXD skill sets. And last year I was on the interview circuit after losing my job because of the pandemic. So I did quite a few interviews, and I always prepped like, okay, this is how I'm going to really explain my point of view on instructional design, which would include LXD and
Yeah.
visual and all of that. But I also made sure to dedicate some time to talking about adult learning theory in my notes. And very rarely did we get into that discussion with the people
Yep.
interviewing me. Some of them were learning managers, like, so they're in learning. Some of them were not. They were just trying to hire someone to help with learning. So I think that is very interesting that, and I'm curious how other people feel who are interviewing. Do people ask you about adult learning theory? Or are they asking about your ability to design for the user?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't, it's been such a long time since I've interviewed, but when I think, I mean, while people type in chat and share their thoughts, I'll say, I think employers, I've talked about this before, they care about adult learning theory. It's not that they care less about it. It's that they care about more things than just adult learning theory,
Mm,
and it's that bucket of things that they care about is ever expanding as
mhm,
our roles as learning professionals continue to expand. I mean,
mm,
it used to be that if you were e-learning designer, that was, the programs you had to use, like Adobe Flash or some other complicated program, those required specific unique skill sets because they were such hard programs to learn and use. But now, you can create a PowerPoint, you can hop into Storyline and create e-learning. You don't need to know code or how to do anything. And so I think I think adult learning theory is not becoming less important. It's just becoming not it's becoming one of many other things that they care
right,
about.
right.
Um
Yeah.
yeah.
And that concerns me a little bit because you're seeing more of the unicorn problem. Like
Oh my God,
they're
yeah.
trying to hire one person to do the jobs of 8 people, but you're not paying them to do the jobs of 8 people.
Yeah.
So I'm scared about that for us in the industry personally. Now we're in a good space because instructional designers are like, we're real lit right now. Like it's
Yeah.
real exciting for us to get hired right now after the pandemic. But I do think that people are going to land in some roles where they're going to burn out.
Oh yeah.
And that's why a lot of people I talk to who are getting into the industry, they're like, I don't know what I need to learn first. And I keep telling them to focus on one thing, but I actually understand why you're like, what do I need to learn first? Because these jobs want you to be a video editor. They want you to,
HTML and
yeah.
JavaScript and LMS admin and needs analysis and
And
project,
they
I
want
mean,
you to know that
and visual
in your
design.
first ID job. They want you to
Yeah.
come out of the gate knowing all of that. I
Yeah.
picked up on that stuff through different jobs.
Oh, I know.
Like,
Yep. Yeah, I mean, there's such a desire to create that T-shaped employee, right? Have you heard of that term,
yeah.
Nyla? T-shaped?
Oh,
Yeah.
yes.
For those of you who aren't familiar, T-shaped employee is somebody who has broad capability but deep expertise. So they want people who can do a little bit of everything if you need to or if you have to, but you have a deep expertise. And like for me, I can define really clearly what my T-shape is. Like I can do just about anything in the process if you need me to. But like the thing I'm really good at is e-learning development with a focus on visual design and articulate storyline. The problem is that employers are, they got the broad part down, but then they're like the T is, it's just becoming a big square now. It's not a big T, it's a big square, if that makes sense.
Mhm,
And because they want everyone to have deep expertise in everything.
mm,
I'm still of the opinion most job descriptions, they throw everything
yeah.
in the kitchen sink in it. And you're right. They're asking for a unicorn and they're never going to find it. And so for me, I tell people it can be hard when you don't know what you specialize in yet. So go get yourself exposed to a lot of stuff and
Mhm,
then figure out what really drives you and lean into that hard. And eventually that position where they want that deep expertise, whatever that thing is, it'll come its way. Um, I don't
yeah.
know. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Our next question comes from, that was a good tangent, by the way, that we went down. Our next question comes from Marcella. Hey, Marcella. Marcella wants to know, how does the profile of the professional, the skills, the knowledge, the mindset differ from ID versus LXD? Again, I think we kind of talked about this. I'll give my 2 cents just to reiterate this, and then Nyla, if you have anything else to add. Again, I think it's this broader look at the things that we're creating, the experiences our learners are having outside of just the individual learning object. That's how I view it, but I don't know, Nyla, do you have different thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. It's more from moving, just also think of it as I'm not just creating this one-off solution, but an entire experience for the learner, even though, well, anyway, we can talk about that later.
Yeah.
And then additionally, I don't know, I think a lot of LXDs are like, I'm doing art and IDs are doing science. I think either way, we're all doing a little bit of both.
Yeah.
We're using some scientific method in both to figure out, what is it that we need, what gap do we need to close, or what problem we're trying to solve. And then the art of it is that empathy. Art is empathy, and understanding how people feel about things and their motivation and all of that. So yeah, just again, I really think that it is difficult to make the clear distinction. But if you never knew what instructional design was, then yeah, it's very clear to you that what you're doing is different.
Sure. Maybe one way to think about it is I oftentimes talk about the difference between training and learning. And there's a reason why it's not called training experience design. Because training, the difference between training and learning is this. Learning is something we're doing all the time. It's a process of experiences over time. Training is a thing that happens. You go to a workshop, you take an ILT course or a e-learning course in the LMS. That's a training event. The problem is just learning doesn't happen because of a training event. Learning happens because they take the training event and then they apply things after the fact and then they evaluate, and it's a thing that happens over time. Learning experience design is designing for that stuff that happens over time, not just the training event.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's really good. Yeah, that's a good framework for it.
I'm gonna have to write a blog post about that. All right, our next question comes from Mary. Mary wants to know, what resources would you recommend for IDs looking to upskill with UI, UX skills? I mean, first off, I would definitely check out what Nyla mentioned earlier, the LXD, is it LXD.org? Is a great resource. What other resources can you think of for UI, UX skills, Nyla?
Coursera has some really great certificate, like a Google certificate on UX that's very manageable to, like, with your other, meaning you can work and do this as well. You don't have to like quit your job and go enroll in this big program. Before that, when I was trying to brush up, I would just go on Udemy and pay $10, and I just wanted like an overview, definitions, and I could find a course from somebody just talking about UX, so I could get like a foundation for what it is. And then there's the Interaction Institute. Is that what they're called? I think
that sounds right.
They've got a lot of free resources. I like to follow actual UX designers that don't only work with learning. And follow also like go to design curation websites. So if you're trying to, exactly, Dribbble is one of my favorites. But what was really important for me was to understand, what is UX, what is UI. UX isn't just visual design. I think a lot of people think that. So once I understood that, that really helped upskill me a little bit. But yeah, I would invest a little bit of money, if you can, into it, so that you have a commitment to learning it. But there's also lots of free resources about UX. And I think there are more people in the learning community as well who are starting to create like UX focus. Melissa Milloway is a good person to follow as well. And I was inspired by, like, Tim, your portfolio and the work that you've done also really inspired me to look more into how to create a full experience, both visually and in the interaction and in everything. So there are people all around you who can inspire you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Melissa Milloway, Kath Ellis talks a little bit about it. The other thing I'd recommend is a big part of learning it outside of the formal resources that Nyla mentioned is just starting to pay attention to it. So,
Mm.
for example, like I can't remember the website. If you Google this, you'll find it. But Google's UI standards, I can't remember what their website's called, but just Google's UI standards, and they have a whole website that defines how their user interface is designed and looks and feels, and or look at mobile apps or websites that are well designed and like ask yourself, like, stop looking at the content and go, why does this button look like a button, or how
Mhm.
is it telling me what I want it to do without being explicit? Like all of those things. Same thing with visual design. You pay attention to how things are designed. The more appreciation and you pay attention to it, the more you'll start understanding how those formal practices are applied in the real world, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Next question comes from, and I'm going to apologize if I get it wrong, Pingala. Pingala wants to know tips and tricks to enhance learning experience. That's a broad question. I don't know. What are some of your top tips and tricks for enhancing the learning experience, Nyla?
Recently, I've just been really, which has been hard because of the pandemic, but really been trying to like just talk to our users all the time. And unfortunately, surveys only go so far. People they ignore them. You got to beg people to take them, especially if you work in an environment where people are not in front of a computer.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are someone who works with industries where people are on shop floors or anything like that, I would love to connect with you and create kind of a network around that, because I've come from an environment where my users were behind a computer and it was really easy to contact them.
Yeah.
I'm now working in an environment where I have a very mixed group of people, and I'm always looking for new ways to do that. But talking to the user a lot more than I'm used to, like going and seeing them, not just emailing them, is something that I've been trying to work on and improve. And I think it's the main skill that I've been trying to, or the thing I'm trying to do to improve my designs.
I love that. It's amazing to me. It's always amazing to me how little we as learning professionals go and, we survey people all the time, but like go spend a day working with them or half a day and like live in their shoes and ask them questions. I mean, one of the things I used to do when I worked at GoDaddy, we would do a lot of user acceptance testing of our content. And so we would, if we were launching an e-learning course, we'd bring in some learners and we would just sit back and watch them go through the course. And that helped us make the UI better and the user experience better, because we would see like what was obvious to us was clearly not obvious to them. And then we got to find out, well, what struggles did they have with all sorts of things, like accessing the LMS and finding content. And, sometimes, and this is especially true of subject matter experts, you get so ingrained in the thing that you do every day that you forget how to empathize with the people who aren't ingrained with it.
Yeah.
And so, it's empathy. It all comes back to that. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Next question comes from Christiane. Hi, Christiane. What are the common and different qualities an ID or an LXD must have? How can they learn from each other?
Wait, can you read that one more time?
Yeah. What are some of the common and different qualities in an ID or an LXD, or an ID or an LXD must have? So what are the common and different qualities each of the two roles must have, and how can they learn from each other? Do you have thoughts on that?
I think before I learned more about UX, like we storyboarded, but I didn't really prototype or create an MVP and test it and then improve upon it. Kind of like the iPhone model.
Yeah.
So that's something that we're doing a lot more. So we actually released we released an MVP to market. It was a little self-assessment tool.
Yeah.
And, and then we got feedback from people. So it went live and people are able to use it. And that, I didn't do that before. Before with it, when I was just like maybe doing a waterfall approach. I mean, once it was locked in, I was like, oh my gosh, upload it to the LMS so I can move on to my next project.
Thing. Yep.
Yeah, I don't even want to look at it again. So Yeah,
In those cases, people don't even go back and look at the survey data of how they like the course, right? I love that. That's a great tip. For those of you who aren't familiar with what MVP means, as minimally viable product, and that comes from usually like the engineering world, and technology companies do this all the time, like the iPhone thing that Nyla mentioned. It's releasing to the market the most minimally viable thing that they could sell to people. And the
So it's not a prototype. It works.
It works. And it's meant to quickly get something out there, so they can make money off of it. But then the dual purpose is to get feedback and iterate on the next version. And so, like, I think most people know this, but if you don't, like, iPhone just released iPhone 13. They're probably working on iPhone 16 and 15 and 14 simultaneously, because they're learning in each year. It's just an MVP, right? And they're probably mixing and matching and figuring out which features they're going to launch for the next one, depending on what's ready at that moment. MVP is a great philosophy. And the other thing I would say is, to your point earlier about just like getting that course launched in the LMS, and so you can move on to the next one. The thing to avoid if you're trying to do MVP is stop gold plating stuff. Gold plating is like the opposite of MVP, where you try to make it like perfect before you launch it, and it's just never going to be that way. So I like that. That was a great one. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, that was a good point. Okay. Yeah.
I heard you inhale. Like I thought you were going to add something else.
Oh, well, somebody did say, can I show you an example of the MVP? And I can't. I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah. Google it. You'll probably find one, a good example of MVP stuff. Okay. I think we have time for a few more questions. I'm going to try to find some that we didn't answer. Let's do Kim's real quickly. Kim wants to know, what's the name of the podcast? I assume that she's referring to your podcast.
Oh, my podcast is called I'm New Here, a podcast for new instructional designers. It's, I'll just drop should I put a link in the chat?
Yeah, go right ahead.
It's available wherever you listen to podcasts, but I can drop a link.
Perfect. This is a good question. I want to tackle this one quickly because I have thoughts on this. I'm curious to know yours on this, Nyla. So Marina wants to know, as either an ID or LXD, some people feel that these individuals should also be subject matter experts on the content they create. What's your take on that? Let me give my take real quickly because I have thoughts on it, but I'm curious to know what you think, Nyla. One of the questions I often hear from folks is people are scared or feel uncertain about creating content on topics that they're unfamiliar with. And I've learned personally, I love creating courses or training on topics that I don't know, because I have the opportunity, it goes back to empathy, I have the opportunity to go through that transformation for my learners, from not knowing anything to knowing enough about it to create a good learning experience on it. And so I feel like, do you need to be subject matter experts on the topics of content you're creating training on? No, but you should allow yourself to go through that transformation of being, what's the phrase, consciously incompetent to having some conscious competence about it, because that will allow you to then go, oh, I get it now, and then create those same experiences for others. Otherwise, you're just relying on your subject matter experts. And when we just rely on our subject matter experts completely, nothing ever good comes from that, in my opinion. So I don't know. Your thoughts on that, Nyla?
So I can't think of a time when I've ever been a subject matter expert on what I've worked on. So I think that's really limiting yourself in your career if you feel like you need to know ahead of time what you're working with.
Yeah.
And I worked in oil and gas, where I was doing creating learning solutions on mud, like the chemistry of mud. And I've done really in-depth, complicated learning solutions for subject matter experts around like chemical engineering and design engineering and oil and gas. I didn't have any idea what they were talking about even after. So they were talking about some really hard stuff. So yeah, I think it's actually harder to be the subject matter expert and the learning designer, because it's just a lot of energy. to
Right, because
have
you have to
to,
like deprogram all
yeah,
your biases about that content, right? Or what you think
right.
people just come programmed with.
Now, if it's something that you're like passionate about, you're like, I really love yoga and I'm going to build this, online course ecosystem on yoga, that's different. Or like
Yeah.
for you, Tim, and
Yeah.
you're the SME of your academy, that's
Yeah.
different. But it is hard. It's definitely hard.
Yeah. I mean, I used to, when I got into e-learning, I used to catch shoplifters for a living. And then I got in a job where I was training others how to catch shoplifters. I was my own subject matter expert. It was
Mm,
great, and I was very nervous when I moved into a role where I was creating training content on topics I didn't know a lot about. But I found that to be like, it allowed me to better empathize with my learner, not being the subject matter expert. Um, Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you know way more about the composition of mud than most people need to know. I could list all sorts of crazy things I know now about like steel reinforced concrete and
yeah,
double entry accounting and all sorts of things that
yeah.
I never wanted to learn about those things, but now I do, having had to create courses on them. All right. We have a bunch of other questions that we weren't able to get to, so I apologize. Before we wrap up, we can both Nyla and I will share where you can contact us if you want to continue the conversation and send your questions our way. But a couple quick things I'll put in chat. So first off, by all means, feel free to join us inside the e-learning designers community. I just put a link to that in chat. It's a 100% free community. We do all sorts of things like we have challenges and we feedback Fridays, and it's just a small growing community of others in the industry. If you want to check out our upcoming e-learning career chats, I put a link to that where you can find those. I have Melissa Milloway coming up in a few weeks, Mike Taylor talking about free tools. And then, of course, feel free to check out the eLearning Designers Academy. It's my 8-week cohort program, and enrollment for our next cohort opens next Tuesday. So that'll be the final one I do this year. So Nyla, where can people find you if they want to learn about Design by Humanity, your podcast, if they want to continue asking questions, where can people go?
Sure. So I'm on LinkedIn. Just search Nyla Spooner, Nylaspooner. And then everywhere else, I'm Nyla LXD. So that's my website, and that's my Twitter handle, and that's me on Instagram. So if you have any questions that you want to ask, feel free to ask them. I will try to answer them for you. I also want to say that I mentioned LinkedIn tips. I have like a little workbook if you need that for how to like use LinkedIn. And I talked a little bit about visibility, but I just want to say that I'm also in a season of growth. And so I'm not as active as I used to be, but things ebb and flow, and you should be okay with that. So,
I agree.
and if you're in a season of growth, accept that you're doing the best that you can, considering the crazy world we live in. And just remember that it's work that you can enjoy, but it's just work. It's not life.
Yeah. And while we're being touchy-feely and fluffy about stuff like that, which I love, don't compare yourself to others as you're in your seasons of growth. Like focus on, like if you spend more time looking back at the competition, you're worrying about their race, not yours. So, do what works for you, right? Focus on what you're doing. I love that.
Exactly.
Good. Well, thank you so much, Nyla. Have a good evening, and thank you everyone who joined us today. Bye.
Have a good day, everyone.